effects of poverty starts in the neighborhood and moves to the brain. That over time, what happens in our communities, what happens in your home, that deprivation, that is economic, some of it, a lot of it, most of it, starts in the neighborhood and ends up in the brain. So we know that poverty and other forms of economic hardship negatively affects neurocognitive development, which in turn affects IQ, mental health, and things like school achievement. It also affects, and I've done some studies on this myself, what we call affect dysregulation. So that means being able to be in a difficult situation, being able to control your emotions in certain situations. So if one of you started screaming because you're triggered by something I've said, I would say, from a clinical standpoint, I would say, oh, that person is dysregulating. That's because you're not able to control your emotions or be appropriate in certain terms. And that's because of trauma. I would say, oh, this person is having difficulty dysregulating, and it's because they've experienced trauma. And this is what we find sometimes when we look at it. And of course, I'm not talking about every poor person out there in the world, but I'm talking about in the aggregate, and this is, it happens quite often. So, but we understand too that poverty constrains development in a way that forces low-income children into what has been described as a limited box, while non-poor children grow up in a spacious playground. They understand that they can take opportunities, they can take risks, and their consequences are not the same. Children who are growing up in poverty do not have that playground. They have to maybe beg for food. Maybe they have to control their family situation. Maybe they feel burdened and stressed. So it's a different situation. Not everyone's on the same page. And then as children age, it actually becomes more and more difficult for those in poverty to escape that developmental box. So by the time low-income children reach adolescence, they are more likely than their non-poor counterparts to experience some of the things we've already talked about, like dropping out of high school, being victims of crime, but they also are more likely to experience developmental problems. Or we start to see the factors of stress, like dysregulation. Some may have protective factors that foster resilience in them, and that's what we often try to look for. But many of them have a difficult time trying to shake off the long-term effect of poverty even after they leave poverty. And this is one of the things we've started to look at. So even as children grow into adults, and let's say that adult was, maybe they were particularly innovative, maybe they were able to work their way out of poverty. That is a small population, by the way, at least in most industrialized countries. We like to believe in the American dream. And it's great, it's a dream. We should dream. But the reality, one of the greatest predictors of being an adult in poverty is having grown up in poverty. And so we know that, and if you're a person of color, and that's any color in the United States, and you grow up in poverty, it's a very good, just a 70% chance actually. And if you're African American, it's a 70% chance that you will spend half of your adult life in poverty. And so what we see in the US is that poverty has a long-term effect. We actually see it around the world. And it's true that people can leave poverty. But what we start to see is that because of what was holding us back, it's not just not having money, but the psychological impact, the societal impact. So what do people who are poor, what do they lack? They lack resources. But what's a resource? A resource, one of the greatest resources that wealthier people, middle-class people have, other than money, are other people. So my colleague does work on social isolation. It's a very important role. It's a very important area to look at. So I study social capital, which is not unrelated, but with social capital, many of you are familiar with, are sociologists yourselves, so you may be familiar with the idea of the strength of weak ties. And for those of you who don't know what that term refers to, it's the idea, it's an economic idea, that you get greater benefit, particularly economic benefit, from not from those you are close to, but from those who are friends of, are connected to those you are close to. So if my classmate, if I'm looking for a job and I go to my classmate and I say, you know, we graduated together, we're great friends, I am looking for a job, how can you help me? My classmate, it could happen, but chances are my classmate won't say, great, Robert, I have a job for you. He's going to say, you know what, I know someone, I know the CEO of Apple or Google, and they're looking for an academic to come and help them out with their situation, and he will connect me to his friend. So it's called a weak tie. And it's the strength of weak ties. And what poor people may, or may not, but they may have strong, strong ties. They know if you live in a poor community, you might know each other. You might benefit from each other in some way or another, but ultimately everyone's poor. So they might have strong ties. What they lack are weak ties. And it's the strong, weak ties that make a difference. So we have a belief in America, and I've seen this in my work in the Philippines, we have a belief that everybody does it on their own. Nobody does it on their own. Everybody has received help from someone else. And this is why social isolation matters. This is one of the reasons. Social isolation, being in an isolated community, is why it matters. So one of the best things we can do, or one of the things we can do, is connect people to other people. But that's something that low-income people don't have. So over time, what does that do? Social isolation also takes a psychological toll. Your brain is affected. Your opportunities are limited. You build up a rage. So I spent a lot of time looking at this in the United States. But simultaneously, I was also doing some work in the Philippines. And it made me wonder. Well, it made me wonder because I saw certain patterns. I saw certain patterns of thinking. And one of those I've already mentioned was that my participants in the Philippines, they understood poverty as an individual issue. They didn't look at it from a larger societal factor. So they very often blamed other people or poor people for their problems. And interestingly, the thing that made me really take a look at this was that poor people also blamed poor people for their problems, except themselves. So they would say things like, oh, my neighbor, they are getting welfare services, They don't need it. They really have everything they need. Oh, we're getting welfare services too, but we don't act like that. We do that in the United States too. We say, or people often say, oh, that family over there, they get welfare, they have so many kids, and they're taking advantage of the system. I'm in the system too, but I'm not taking advantage of it. And part of that is because we all get the same information. So we have all the stereotypes about poor people, whether or not we're poor. And so I started to see certain things in the Philippines, in this community where I worked, that was consistent with what I saw in the United States. What I didn't see, well, what I thought I didn't see, had to do with race. And I thought the United States was special because we have a special relationship with race. We've got many issues when it comes to race in the United States, to the point where, and I often tell my students this, any of you who come to the United States and you think you're white, the United States will tell you what you are. You cannot pick your own race in the United States. And we do it both officially and unofficially. So we have a very complicated relationship with race. And then I realized something as I started to look at the Philippines. First at the Philippines. Other countries have their own version of race. In the Philippines, it's a little bit of colonialism, so there are some racial issues, there's skin tone issues. There's regional issues, similar to China in that way. So when we think about when my students from China say, oh, we don't have race, and I say, but you have regions, and you discriminate by regions, and you discriminate by birth certificates. So if it's not race, it's immigrant status. It is something. In the US, we don't just discriminate by race, just so you know. We also discriminate on everything else, too. So, but race is a big factor. And just to think about what I saw in the Philippines in my work, I started to see a similar pattern. I studied a community for 6-7 years, and I saw the same 1 and 5% problem, as I like to call it. We tracked economic development. We actually even helped with some of the economic development in some of the barangays, some of the villages in the Philippines. And one particular location did experience a bit of economic growth. And that economic growth went to the 1% in that population. And they shared it with the 5%. So as I'm interviewing families and working with families over the span of 6 years, and I ask about economic growth, or I try to discern whether or not they've been affected by it, they were saying no, and there was no evidence that they were wrong. They were saying no, we see that we now have this building, or we have this new job, these new jobs. We don't have those jobs. Those jobs went to the friends of the 1%, which often represented the 5%. And that happens that was happening in the US as well. The other thing I saw in the Philippines had to do with this idea that of demographic groups and how different demographic groups were being affected. So in the United States, and I mentioned that the largest growing poor population are whites. In the Philippines, they have a population, because race isn't exactly the same, they have a large population of poverty, of poor people In my community, 70% of the citizens are poor. The residents are poor. The Philippines they need those poor people, just like the US needs their poor people. So in the Philippines, it's a little complicated, but in order to get a vote, you very often pay for that vote. Middle-class people, you tend to not have to pay them to vote, but you do have to pay the poor population, or they won't go out, or they won't vote for you. So in a system like that, if you're a politician, you need that vote. So you need people to stay poor. In the United States, one trend that we're seeing is that there's a growing white population. That is not a mistake. That's why we have the president we have. Those are poor white people, primarily, not entirely, that supported President Trump, and he needs them. And the politicians in the United States, if any of you have paid any attention there, pit racial groups against each other. And they very often tell poor whites that the reason you're poor is because of the immigrants coming in from Mexico, African Americans, of all the foreigners who are coming in and taking your jobs. That's why you're poor. They say nothing about their economic investments. They say nothing about the restructuring of the vote. They say nothing about killing the farm systems. That's not why they're poor. They say nothing about the profits that corporations receive. We had a giant tax break where the poorest people paid more taxes and the higher income people paid less. But the reason you're poor is because of the immigrants. The reason you're poor is because of black people. That system is not absent in the Philippines. So I've spoken to you probably long enough. and because I haven't been tracking my time, I'm not 100% sure how much time I have. But at the end, I want to talk just briefly about some of the patterns I've seen. Some of this is just in the United States and in the Philippines, but I think there's some similarities across many countries and similarities to maybe what some of you have experienced. So one of the things that I've seen, and one of the big indicators of poverty within a country, has to do with the governance of that country. So government policies are very often an issue. Putting aside for a second countries where wars and civil unrest might affect the economic situation, just putting that aside, particularly in industrialized countries, we have policies that benefit the wealthy and hurt the poor. We have lack of human capital, so access to education, educational opportunities. That's another pattern that exists across countries, U.S., Philippines, other countries as well. Of course, unemployment and underemployment. Limited opportunities for women. I could give another lecture on the importance of the economic development of women. And in the Philippines especially, that is an area of where there could be growth, there could be opportunities, but often the opportunities are limited. In the US, we have a system of lack of access to health and healthcare. Family structure is a big issue really around the world. So there are comparisons to be made. And as I started this, I talked about the idea how it's unfair to look at developing countries versus industrialized countries. So when we look at countries like Singapore, for example, I met a gentleman from Singapore who said, I met him in the Philippines, and he said, if you really want to experience a society where there's no poverty, you should come to Singapore. And that shocked me because I had heard differently. And I have a colleague over here from Singapore who can maybe shed light on this. When I looked at the poverty rate of Singapore, I saw 26%, or in that ballpark, 25, 26%. So my colleague from Denmark, I agree. Using the United Nations $1.90 a day, Denmark has no poverty. If you look at the relative poverty that exists in Denmark, then it's about 17%. So when Denmark sets its own poverty rate, most countries set their own poverty rate. Norway, 15%, Sweden, about 16%. Japan, which hid its poverty for years, is about 16%. US is about 15%. So there's a pattern here. Germany is also about 16%, I think. There's a pattern, with some exceptions. And that is poverty in the industrialized world. It's very, very similar. The percentages, anyway, are very, very similar. And you look at why it exists and how it exists, there's similarities there as well. So I think it's important, and I would never argue against looking at extreme poverty. I think it's one of the warts on the world. We really should eliminate extreme poverty. I think, though, that if it's important to look at the whole picture when it comes to poverty. We risk, when we only focus on extreme poverty, we risk missing relative poverty. And so what that means is that if we can eliminate we can eliminate extreme poverty without focusing on, or at least spending some time looking at and thinking about the relative impact of all poverty. So I'm going to end there, and oh, sorry. See, I had a feeling I was running out of time. So I'm going to end there, and I just want to remind you, and I'll end with this. I started with Erin. Erin does not live in extreme poverty, but she lives in a poverty that is going to last her a lifetime, and that's the poverty that we should think about too. Thank you very much.